de Paquer. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. I'm more than happy to kickstart the conference, Cosmopolitan Democracy in a world of rising populism, deepening polarization, and rampant neoliberalism. And I would like to say a few words on what the conference is about, and then turn over to our distinguished guest, Professor Saskia Sassen. Professor Sassen was kind enough to come and share her thoughts with us at a very busy time for her, and she has had quite a journey, as she said, from Quito, so we're very grateful. After Professor Sassen's talk, Professor Fuad Geyman will deliver a commentary, and then we will proceed with discussion. Now, the research I carried out with my Mercator IPC fellowship was as much about climate change activism in Turkey as about the analysis of local transnational engagements and its implication for cosmopolitan democracy. So the conference brings together these diverse interests in how states and citizens change, with a specific focus on ecological concerns as cosmopolitan frames. With the recognition that borders are being consolidated today geographically, politically, socially, rising right-wing populism taps into and feeds increasing fears of the other, using a very powerful us versus them discourse. The influx of refugees into the EU, arguably the most cosmopolitan political project, as a result of war in the Middle East, presents a context in which populism can gain ground, making the adoption of a humanitarian collective solution to the crisis increasingly improbable. The ideas of participatory democracy and pluralism are being eclipsed by the democratic deficit, characterized by a growing distance between decision makers and their electoral base, polarization, and increasing power of authoritarian tendencies in various geographies, including this one. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, erodes spheres of solidarity and democratic engagement through the commodification of the commons. So, in short, increasing populism, extremism, authoritarianism, and the commodification of the commons weaken the loosely defined values that cosmopolitan democracy is built on, such as difference, diversity, and participation on the basis of recognition of rights of individuals by virtue of their humanity. The two major responses to dealing with diversity, assimilation, and multiculturalism have failed. The former generates injustice and violence and cannot hold together plural and transnational societies. The latter emphasizes cultural belonging, but cannot really address interaction between different groups. So, in such a context, can cosmopolitan democracy provide a viable alternative political project? Now, of course, cosmopolitanism has always had its fair share of critiques for offering a weak basis for political action and social integration, for not generating grounded, deep stories. However, considerable work has also been done to show that it's not merely an elite affair. Various crises, financial crises, refugee crises, and of course the ecological crises, have pushed on us forcefully the reality of living with others in precarious ecological and economic conditions of instability, what Ulrich Beck has called the cosmopolitan imperative. Thus, people have researched how cosmopolitanism can be embedded, contested, migrant, and transgressive. So I hope that the conversation started in this conference will contribute to furthering efforts to make the notion of cosmopolitan democracy measure up First, by inquiring into everyday interactions and local political action in relation to, of course, transnational structures and cosmopolitan frames. And second, by debating how right-wing, populist, neoliberal, and exclusionary trends can be counteracted through solidarities established around democracy, ecological concerns, and justice. Now, this raises a number of questions. How prevalent is everyday cosmopolitanism? In what ways do people cross borders into different geographies, into different identity groups, into different ways of living? How can ordinary encounters and interactions transfer into national and transnational politics? And can the analysis of concrete conflicts in the local transnational nexus repoliticize increasingly bureaucratic and technical solutions? So these are some of the questions we will address in this two-day conference. The speakers will unpack the challenges of rising racism, populism, intolerance, brought into the highlight by such political developments as Brexit, Orban's referendum, Trump's election campaign, and the European response to the refugee crisis. We will also reflect on increasing intractability of neoliberalism, manifested especially through the commodification of services, through enclosures of commons, extractive policies, and land grabs. This contributes to exacerbating inequalities, which in turn makes it really difficult for democracy to deliver, as evidenced by ecological and urban struggles. Now, Saskia Sassen identifies these exacerbating inequalities and political exclusions as a systemic shift. So in today's global phase of capitalist development, the extension of capitalist relations has its own specific mechanisms, and they have to be differentiated from older forms. And this is, as Sassen puts it, systemic deepening of advanced capitalism. And one component of its organizing logic has to do with how people are devalued as workers and consumers. Before, people were at least valued as workers, consumers. This is not the case anymore. So this leads to what Sassen has called expulsions. The expulsion, for instance, of people, immiseration, and exclusion of growing numbers of people, and the destruction of traditional capitalisms to feed the needs of high finance and global capitalist production. She also talks about other expulsions in relation to ecological catastrophes of dead land and dead water, and hopefully you will say something on this. Okay. Yes, so the speakers will also focus on alternative forms of organization and everyday practices of living together and contending together. These encounters transpire in public spheres, and solidarities are forged across borders to contend against the risks of climate change, financial insecurity, and various forms of exclusion. So the daily ordinary engagements across social and political borders are in fact embedded in grassroots dynamics of collaboration and conflict. The recognition of these dynamics in a variety of geographies in relation to a variety of issues may help repoliticize the cosmopolitan agenda, often criticized for lacking a solid basis of political action. It might also help problematize the depoliticized understanding of global issues such as climate change. So it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Saskia Sassen, who of course needs no introductions actually. Saskia Sassen is Robert S. Lynn Professor of Sociology at Columbia University and a member of its Committee on Global Thought. She's one of the leading authorities on issues of globalization, the urban as social and political space, immigration, and states in the world. I can perhaps capture the breadth and depth of her work with this example. It is possible to explain globalization, inequality, and gender all at once, just focusing on a single chapter on global city and women. I know because I've done it. So, she has written several books and in numerous articles. Some of her books include The Mobility of Capital and Labor, The Global City, Globalization and Its Discontents, Guests and Aliens, and most recently, Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy. So, thank you very much.
Well, that was, I think she deserves that. That was encyclopedic. Do you understand? You covered so many subjects. Very, very, very impressive. And I, of course, agree with a lot of what you said. I should say I brought some books. I always like to bring books, but we authors do not necessarily have, many books at home. But I brought 3 little books, also light to carry. And I just only hope that they're open access books. How is that for putting it? You know what I mean? I don't want them to disappear in a professor's office, so that they should circulate a bit. Now, so it's really, I was very keen on making it to Istanbul. The subject, the people involved, the moment, the place. I don't need to elaborate. Let me sort of put on the table 3 elements that mark the way I work issues. So first, it seems to me that over the last decades, really since, let's just say since World War II, for a particular part of the world. I grew up in Latin America, where it plays a bit differently. World War II is really Northern Europe, the United States. That marks a difference. And it seems to me that you already alluded to it, that's very interesting. That was capitalism, but it was a sort of ironic capitalism. Because in fact, mass consumption, as you said, dominated. It was the dominant logic organizing capitalism. The capitalists may have been as nasty as they are today, but the issue was that they benefited, if mass consumption is the dominant logic, from every, most of the working class, most of the middle class, etc., having added, rising incomes, their sons and daughters doing better. So it was that kind of mix. So they actually pushed very, very nasty extractive firms, pushed governments. Yes, give them support for health, give them support for education, give them support to buy a house, because that benefited that particular logic. What begins to happen in the 1980s, which is often referred to with the term the neoliberalizing of capitalism, a term that I find a bit too specific. When you go around the world, neoliberalism is not as self-evident a category as it might be. I don't know, I would be very interested here in Turkey if it is. But it certainly is a sort of deeply Western Europe, North America, and parts of Latin America kind of term. But then what happened, so the language that I like to say is, we moved from a dominant logic based on mass consumption to a dominant logic shaped by an extractive mode. Google starts out 100% extractive. Okay, now they're making a little car. They're not purely extractive. Facebook, extractive. Finance, extractive. So I always say finance, very different from traditional banking. Traditional banking is a commercial operation. It sells something it has, money, for a little price. We call it interest. Huh? Finance, no. Finance sells something it does not have. And in that selling what it does not have lies its danger and its brilliance. Dangerous because it's going to develop instruments to invade whatever is there to be extracted, including very modest operations. But if you have 1 million of them, then you're fine. You can extract value. And it's brilliantly sort of, algorithmic math, etc. Nothing to do with microeconomics. I just want to put that on the table. Too many students think that microeconomics is somehow also about finance. It isn't. I mean, zero. So it's algorithmic math, and we should find a term for it. So finance is a term that works for me because I mark it as different, but it should not be confused with traditional banking. And again, the traditional bank is fine. You know, you buy something for a bit of money, interest. Huh? Now, so that is one issue. Second issue, I wonder whether categories like populism, which are recurring, fascism, etc., they capture something. They're an easy way. Not an easy way, but an enabling way for the average person to get something about a transformation, an alarming transformation. These are all words, concepts that are negatively marked. You can barely say that populism is positive. You can barely say that, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So I just... I was recently on a television debate with Ian Buruma, people like that, you know, very smart people. And they all were saying, we were four for an hour debating. And the other three, people I really like and I really admire, but all three were sort of stuck, I thought. I didn't quite say it, I said it afterwards. They know what I think, but so I feel free to say it here again. But I thought they sort of relied too much on existing categories like populism, like etc. For me, those are invitations not to think. Oh yeah, it's populism. Oh yeah, it's, you know, fascism. I mean, what if we went digging? And so one of the aspects that I find myself engaged by, what I like to think as the innards of a condition. Innards, in Spanish, I grew up in Latin America, entrañas. You know, what you have, you know, I don't know how you say that in Turkish, but I would love to hear it. Do you know what I'm talking about, right? We're not talking eyes, hair. We're talking this, the bowels, the innards. I do that with technology too. When I talk about digital technology, which I'm not going to talk about today, but I want to get at the innards of the technology. So what I want to share with you is my perspective of the innards, which means, yes, some sort of cosmopolitan, democratic something, you know, space, operational space, imaginary, two different categories. Huh? An operational space where you can actually talk and move towards nice things like cosmopolitan democracy, and, you know, but those are words that don't work very well for me. I'm brutal. And I should say, in my brutality, my first book got rejected by 12 publishers. I love telling this story. If there are academics in the room, you know what that means, right? Nobody gets to 12 rejections. But I really believed in this book. And so my Mobility of Labor and Capital book, it is, that I'm talking about. And so I sent it out, and I assumed that they would say, yes, we love this book. They say, no. And then I violated the rules of the game, and I sent out to 2, and no. Then I said, well, okay, that's the moment. The third rejection, I've noticed this with my doctoral students, is when you're actually mostly convinced there's something wrong with my manuscript. I went on the warpath. I became a warrior. I said, this book has to stay, and I didn't change a word. I sent it out to 7 publishers at the same time, violating the rules of the game. No. You know what that feels like? I said, wow. At that point, from every rejection, I gained courage. You know what I mean? Yeah, because it was combat. You know, when you look at it as combat rather than what does it say about me, totally different attitude. So that is how I relate also to a whole bunch of conceptual categories. You will see that as I proceed. So it's like a thing. And then, you know, Cambridge University Press published it. Now, I find, so here is a sort of a third point that I want to make. We have accumulated, let's again take since World War II, you know, that epoch when you have mass consumption, you have actually middle classes growing also in Africa. You have manufacturing growing in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which created a middle class. You know, there were some very positive trends. I think that we have accumulated a lot of knowledge coming out of that period, both critical and very positive, etc. it seems to me that what we have done, and Turkey might be different. I know from the Turkish students that I have had as doctoral students, you know, across the, I don't know, 120 years, it feels like that I've been a prof. It isn't quite that long, huh? But it just feels that way. The Turkish students, to me, stood out. I'm talking doctoral students, stood out. Stood out because they navigated. Are you Turkish? Yeah. Well, she's a good example then. They navigated a conceptual zone that was not what we saw in the West. It mixed elements. And I always think of Turkey, I mean, especially certainly Istanbul, at the intersection of so many histories, north-south histories, east-west histories, that sort of unsettles the precious, narrowly defined category for analysis. And I was not the only one who thought that way. Huh? And lately we have not gotten a lot of Turkish students somehow in the social sciences at Columbia University. I don't know why that is, so there is something here that I've always felt that induces a kind of scholarship and a kind of analytics that I like a lot, that goes beyond. But coming back to a narrower Western perspective, West here is a bit ambiguous. It's not a geographic term, you understand, right? It could be parts of India, it's a mode that installs itself in distinct geographies. So we have accumulated vast amounts of knowledge. When you look at the academy, the academic side of it, we have built silos. And because we're operating inside silos, which are increasingly narrowly defined, every new addition is a bit less significant, it seems to me. I don't want to offend anybody here. And so we have accumulated more and more. And then we have these silos. So one of the issues that I raised in my expulsions book, I brought a copy here for you all, is whether the time has come to begin to disassemble those silos, to begin to interrogate whether a certain level of specialized and narrow focus, which on the one hand you need to produce knowledge, at some point is also an obstacle to understanding something. So when, is that my, oh, okay, for instance, one of the issues that I raised in the expulsions book is, okay, so we have a lot of knowledge about long-term prisoners, which are truly, it's an abuse of the human condition. And the United States is probably exhibit number one. There are a few other countries that we might want to put there lately, but we're not going to talk about that part. So secondly, refugee camps, third generation refugee camps. They were not meant to be third generation. You know, the homeless, the growing number of homeless that we have everywhere. They are there in Germany. They're certainly in the United States. We have millions, you know. And then sort of the informal world of the periferia, as they say, the slums, you know, part of the slums. I mean, do we need to at some point, and I use this as an example, I'm not saying this is the core, but do we need at some point to stand back and to say, am I seeing formations that share particular features? And it is to the advantage of analysis, understanding, and data to begin to cut across these divisions. So on the one hand, I repeat, we gained enormous knowledge by specializing in these silos. On the other hand, the moment comes, it seems to me, when we need to revisit that. So one of the issues that I raise in my expulsions book is the need to go back sort of to a ground level to de-theorize. I do this exercise with my students when we're reading certain theoretical texts. I say, let's bring it all down and nail it down on the ground. Big categories, the state, nail it down, same level as a little category. As an exercise, as an exercise to demolish the thick protective walls we have generated, you know, around each of these categories. So in my book Expulsions, I sort of really go into that. And so one way of putting it, of describing what I do, is that my zone, this is a bit exposed. I didn't start that way. That was not a project, I'm going to go there in the zone before method. No, this was exposed. But I think that where I am most comfortable is in that moment, in a trajectory of research and theorization and interpretation, where you have not quite entered and subjected yourself to the established methodological rules of the game. So I call that before method. I just love that image. Now, it also means that I am not throwing method out of the window. Some of my students misinterpret. They say, oh, I'm not going to deal with it. No. I want a strong heart of the paradigm to do what I do. I want to contest that paradigm, but I don't want to throw it out. That's far too easy, and then you're left with nothing, ultimately. You know what I mean? So you raise the level of difficulty for yourself, but you also actually can have a lot of fun. I have a lot of fun. Now, by the way, I'm going through this, and I'll go a bit more through it now, in order to lay an analytic ground within which to understand what is happening today, and then to raise a question as to what are categories that help us. To what extent does populism, yes, it touches on the truth, but it takes us away from really digging deeper and finding perhaps other language. So in that debate that we had in the television, I said, I want a term to capture what we are now loosely calling a kind of rising populism and fascism. I want a term in there, not replacing the others, but added if you want, that captures the pain, the fear, the loss, the brutalizing of people who were once, you know, factory workers with unions, who had a life project. I don't want to lose that part. I don't want to lose the destructions that have happened. And in that sense, I'm interested in the innards of a condition, of today's condition. So I find myself sort of resisting a bit the language, some of the languages, including the term neoliberalism. I want tougher language. I want harder. I want to get at the, as I said, at the innards and at the pain. So now, so what I do, and I recommend that if you're trying to understand an unstable condition, something that is emergent but remains unclear, rather than trotting in the familiar, which is very helpful, but can also keep you from. So I think that my zone of knowledge, and again, I think that there are times in the history of a paradigm when you need that, are the fuzzy edges of paradigmatic knowledge. So I'm still inside the paradigm, but I'm at that part of the paradigm where it is a bit weak, a bit loose, a bit unstable, a bit, okay, how does this help me? A bit useless. That is a zone that I sort of expose, find myself. And so I call that being there and trying to discover something. The practices that are involved at that point are tactical practices. They're not necessarily deeply content-driven. They're tactical, so I call it analytic tactics. Isn't that pretty? That's pretty. No, I think that is just so pretty. But that's my sense of my husband, who is truly an aesthete, always wonders when I say these things. But he's very nice. So he just lets me go on. So here are some of these analytic tactics. And I mentioned very simple practices. These are practices, basically. You know, the need today, in this particular period, not when the center of the paradigm holds, as we had in the post-World War II decades up to the 1980s, I would say. But today when it's sort of fuzzy, the need to actively destabilize stable categories. What is the economy today? What is the middle class? What is the national government? What is populism today? Etc., etc. Now, secondly, in the shadows of powerful explanations, this to me is extremely important because I am still trying to operate within a paradigmatic space. I'm not throwing it out. And so the simplest example, and I've mentioned this many times, so I apologize if you have already heard it on the radio or whatever, is, you know, dark night, strong light on a street, circle of light on the street, the stronger that circle of light, the stronger the paradigmatic category, the more you see everything inside the circle of light, and the less you can see what is around it. You understand what I'm saying, right? That is also a different way of positioning racisms, you know, exclusionary tactics, fear of something that you don't know, like, you know, there's a lot of happening now related to some of the Middle Eastern conditions. It's a different way of looking at it. You are not overmarked something. You just, well, this is all very delicate. Now, territory has long been for me a crucial category. And I think of territory as really, you cannot reduce it to the materiality of terrain, earth, land. Territory is a mix of capabilities and physical conditions. But I am now also working on non-physical territories, like the territories of finance, and on the notion that territory can be nomadic. So I think of territory as a complex condition that includes power logics, the state, you know, the liberal state in our history in the West, and the capacity to make claims, citizenship in our Western modernity as an effective condition, not as a fiction, as we have it a bit in the United States right now, I would say. Now, expulsions, by expulsions, I came up with a term which I try to sharply differentiate from social exclusion. Social exclusion happens inside a system, and there is always the possibility that it's going to diminish, that something else can happen, that they can become incorporated, so the claims by all kinds of excluded or semi-excluded people, you know, that there is a process. By expulsion, I mean a condition where our established categories of analyses cannot capture that moment when a condition, a familiar condition, not a monstrous condition, I'm talking about the familiar, becomes so extreme that those categories of analysis can no longer grab it. The two simplest examples are, that I use in the book, but there are many, many examples, are the long-term unemployed. At some point, I don't know in your country, but certainly in many countries that I know about, at some point the long-term unemployed simply can no longer be counted. The small shopkeeper, cases in Greece, cases in India with small farmers, in many who goes broke and commits suicide, but before filing for bankruptcy. In other words, after he has committed suicide, he can't file for bankruptcy, right? You can see what I mean. Disappears. We don't even know. This Greece was really a natural experiment in that sense. So I just lost, I was thinking about Greece now, which I wrote a lot about Greece. I got totally engaged with Greece. So expulsions is that systemic edge where the familiar assumes a value so extreme that we no longer count it. So this is a conceptual methodological moment. I'm not talking about something that is necessarily a visible physical space. The other example that I have in the book is dead land, dead water. That was the chapter that most engaged me. And so I thought climate change is almost too pretty a word. Climate change, it just sounds fantastic. No, dead land, dead water. And so I have it there, dead land, dead water, without commas or anything. When de facto, and the United States is here, exhibit number 1, Russia could be the companion there. When land is dead, it's as if it doesn't exist. And some countries, Russia and the US, have vast stretches of dead land. I'm mapping all of this now. And so the question that also raises a question, a footnote here, what do governments like the Russian and the American actually govern in their territory if we bring in all this dead stuff, that simply nobody is attending to it? It becomes invisible. It's very material. So something that hangs in there also is the materiality of all of this, and that the material can become so invisible. To me, these are very interesting. I'll give you, as I keep on, I tend to speak too long. I realize I'm only on my second slide, and I have many more. And then finally, the making of it all. This is a very partial approach, but the notion is it didn't just, oh my God, there it is, it fell from the sky. No, we made it. And that gives you a very particular, oopsie. Okay, so what I guess I'm going to show, I have some slides that come to making the destructions that we have made. Now, one way of beginning to frame, and again, I want to keep in hanging here the question of populism, the question of growing inequalities, the question of disadvantaged sectors that are losing ground, the famous third or fourth generation of middle classes in the West that were doing very well and now suddenly they're not. These are all familiar terrain, right? But I want to sort of go deeper. I want to go to the innards. So one way of framing the question and framing one's research is to ask, you know, the sort of rhetorical question, what's the steam engine of our epoch? When the steam engine comes about, it didn't change everything, but it changed some foundational alignments. And I'd love to give this example. If you could have had flown over England in a little plane, there were no planes then, you would have seen a very green rural economy. But that sheep, the animal sheep, sheep, not chic, but sheep, that little woolly animal standing on top of the hill was no longer part of a rural economy. It was located on circuits that connected it with the industrial factories in the cities. So the ambiguity, number one, the taking what is there already rather than destroying what is there in order to make something new. No, the way our complex systems change, this is what I research in my territory book, which I think is my best book, and you didn't mention it. It took me 10 years. I became a monk. I literally became a monk at the University of Chicago. Monk is very different from nun, by the way. A monk is serious stuff. Not that the nuns aren't serious stuff too, but you know the figure. That was a footnote, by the way, if somebody lost a plot here. Where is she going now, the nuns and the monks? So one way of thinking about it is not that which changes everything, but that which can make a new ordering that actually is consequential, right? That doesn't change everything, but still, or what is in and what is out. Now, usually when I ask people, and I mentioned this rhetorical moment here, to allow you to have your own answers, usually the answer has been and continues to be the digital revolution. That most people that I speak to across the world think that that is the answer. And to me it seems that the digital has shifted locus. The digital, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, really begins to make a difference. It creates new possibilities, new operational spaces, new collectivities, but it also leaves out. In the United States, the poor have very little access to the digital, and they have to do dial-up, the telephone. So it has created massive consequences. But it seems to me that today, the digital, with its exclusions, is infrastructural. It's infrastructure. Necessary but indeterminate. That's how I define infrastructure. You have to ask, for what are you going to use it? So it's infrastructure, and in that sense, it's no longer a steam engine. It has been a steam engine. So today, for me, the steam engine is finance. And finance I define, as I said earlier, as an extractive sector. It might as well be mining. When it is done extracting from a particular little mine, in quotation marks, it's out of there. It doesn't care what happens next. Very different from the traditional bank, which wants the sons and daughters, blah, blah, to do better because they depend on that. Finance is extractive. And as I said earlier, I think that our dominant logic today, that doesn't mean the only logic, but the dominant logic is extractive. Now, here's an example very quickly. I just want to, now we're moving into the innards of the system. In other words, I'm not talking populism, etc., because that's not my category. I'm talking how the system actually works and what all it has rendered, partial, poorer, out of the picture sort of thing. Look at this growth curve. We don't have a pointer here, I'm going to. So look at this growth curve. This is 201. This is under 1 trillion, 919, right? 6 years later, oopsie, 6 years later, it's 62, oh great, yeah, great. It's 62 trillion. So think of anything that can grow that much. That is an extraordinary exponential growth. When I see these, in other words, from less than $1 trillion to 62 trillion in 6 years, when I see these numbers, I begin to interrogate. That's definitely part of my practice, this sort of, being at the fuzzy edges. So I say, what really is 62 trillion? What is that? What does that mean? Well, at that point, 2006, global GDP was 54 trillion. At the same time, finance was 62 trillion. Total finance was 600 plus trillion. This is measured in dollars. And so again, 600, so this is just 10% of finance, but it is more than global GDP. So then you begin to think, well, when I say finance, what am I talking about here? So it's not money. We're not talking about money. And when you sort of, you want to nail it down, here I'm talking methodological practices, right? When you want to nail it down and you want to say, all right, so what's the global value of all the currencies issued by central banks in the world? That is money. Well, at that point, it was about 300 trillion. So we know that when we talk finance, we're not talking money. We're talking something else. Money is just a measure. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on this because I really do get carried away. I'm going to skip this. Here, I just very quickly, some of you, is everybody familiar with this case, the subprime mortgage case, which was an instrument designed not to provide housing, but to meet the demands of the high investor circuit who are asking the financiers, give me an asset-backed security, not just a derivative based on another derivative. In other words, give me some real value. Well, in the United States, everything had been financialized, including the $1 trillion of student debt, which had become a financial instrument. Footnote. A bank, a regular bank, confronted with a $1 trillion of student debt, can't do anything with that. Finance? $1 trillion? Good. In debt? What does that matter? It can make it work. And so the financial sector has been very big behind not allowing, a law has been passed in the United States, which is often a brutal, brutal, brutal country, that doesn't allow students to cancel that debt ever. They are forever going to be indebted. And you know why that is of interest to finance? It's not about the students. It's not about punishing. It's that as long as it exists as $1 trillion debt, they can work with it. They can scale it up. So when you begin to look, these are the innards of the system. And this has hit people. And so when I hear populism, I say, wait a minute, populism, the populisms of the past had their own specific. Let's at least understand what are the specifics that are producing this kind of, in quotation marks, populism. Now, so this was another instance. The only thing that was sort of left there to financialize in large numbers was housing. 14 million households were literally used to extract value for the financial circuit. A lot, billions were made by European investors, but the other side, the other circuit, the lower circuit, which was where they got the utility, they had, you know, in the end you owned it's too complicated. Let me just, I realize it. But in the end, these were foreclosures. We had, in 10 years, we have had 14 million households thrown out of their house. This instrument has now been declared illegal in the United States, but it has entered Europe, it has entered India, it probably has entered Turkey, I don't know that for a fact, and it is entering China. It's a brilliant algorithmic mathematical instrument, 16 complex steps. Let's remember, footnote, A firm like Goldman Sachs, like JP Morgan, they have like 100 physicists working on these instruments. Again, as I said earlier, nothing to do with microeconomics. This is far more complex, and it's operational. It has a life. It's not a model. It's an instrument. That is finance. So here's Germany has the highest number. So the numbers, by the way, go on. These are households. So in Germany, it's over 1 million households now, which could be 4 million people, 10 million people. It's invisible. So I'm really operating with the overarching image here is the innards of the system to get at that pain that underlies populism. And the need to also, yes, we can see they become fascist, they are populist, but to at least also put on the table how those people have been treated by a system, not by individuals, again, also but just by a system. How they have been marginalized, impoverished. So populism for me is too easy. I don't know if I'm communicating here. When I look at the innards of the system, I say, wow, this is truly brutal treatment of families, of individuals, of little shops. The other thing is all the franchising of long-standing family firms. Well, it kills these long-standing family firms. I don't know if you have that. I'm sure you have that a bit in Turkey too. Where the corporation, franchises, they always take out something of the consumption capacity of a locality. So when you think about this as an extractive period, a period dominated by an extractive logic, you can begin to say, okay, before I say populism, let me check out, not just how all the attention to these weird politics and these racisms. Yeah, we need the information, but please let us also look at the innards of the system that generates these kind of extraordinary abuses of people. And I don't want to generalize. I don't know enough to say that every time we have a kind of racism, nationalism, populism syndrome, that it is because the system has treated them ill. No, I don't know that. That's a question. But what I know about the current period is that it has been an extremely extractive period. It has really destroyed whole cities, whole economic sectors, whole sort of long-term family businesses. So that has got to be put. And so I find myself really not using the term populism because it's too easy, you see, not because I don't accept that there is populism in that. And often, of course, it's the leaderships that. Now, how much time do I have? Because should I start ending? I have a lot more stuff, but yeah, I was going to tell you something about but I want to show you this, just to get a bit into the innards. So look at this. This is Eastern Europe. I'm especially interested in the Eastern European countries. So they enter a whole new zone, right? They become more capitalist, more liberal in quotation marks. So this period 2000 to 2005 is it's like a natural experiment. Take Hungary. And where's the other one? And Czech Republic, the two at the top. So in 2000, when the new era was just sort of taking off, household debt, because they call it credit, right? This is the IMF staff papers. I get a lot of my information from that. Credit sounds very pretty, but credit is debt, right? So they don't have it, they buy that credit. Huh? So look at Hungary. They had in 2000, 8.5% and then 11.2% for Hungary. 5 years later, Czech Republic, 27%, that's debt, household debt, and 39% for Hungary. Those are very sharp growth curves. On the other hand, Germany, look at its extraordinary stability, 70, 70, 70, as if nothing had happened, no history had happened. And the United States, of course, over 100%. Now, so when I confront these data, I say, okay, who owns that debt? If your little local bank owns that family debt, at least there is a benefit for the community. You pay the interest, that creates possibly more jobs in the bank, whatever. The bank grows, a little bank, right? Well, I went again into the staff papers, etc. So for Hungary, 40% of that debt is owned by global banks, mostly German, Swiss, and Austrian. That is not good. That's how a franchise works. The interest payments, rather than recirculating in that community and allowing the bank to grow and perhaps hire more people, whatever, no. It just goes out. It leaves the whole setup. I don't know if you are following me. So these are innards. These are bits and pieces of the innards of that. And okay, now there's a whole other bit about buying of cities. I'm not going to, but that's another amazing story. I'm going to skip. Yeah, let me just skip. I want to get to. Okay, now we're going to skip that. So new systemics, are we dealing with a logic of extraction? And I sort of wanted to say, actually, yes, we are. But I want to move, these are amazing graphs. I'm just going to stop one of these graphs. So look what happens here. So this is corporate profits, right? After tax, etc., in the United States. So you have this, and then comes this new era, the neoliberal era, and it just grows very sharply. Look how it grows. I mean, it's just extraordinary how neoliberalism benefited corporate sectors. Then comes the crises, which here last, you know, I don't know, 2 days, I exaggerate. It lasted a few years. This is the important curve to notice. After the crises, it goes up. You understand? While most of a country, like 60%, this is the United States, is actually getting poorer. So that is part of the innards, you know, of the system and of some of this. And look at this, when you look at assets, which is more important actually than profits on some level, the crisis starts about, you know, half an hour here. And after that, it is also higher. So what we are dealing with is a very peculiar mode of extraction dressed in extraordinarily complex clothing, you know, so nobody really gets what is happening. And our governments, by the way, our states, look at Germany, a very well-run economy. Germany, central government debt goes up from 13% in 1980 to 44, and now it's up to 50. Now, 50% is almost nothing compared to many countries, but it's a remarkable growth curve. You understand? So there is something that is happening that is too easily lost when we use very generic sort of descriptions. Now, let's see. I wanted to get to a final thing. And I'm leaving these slides, by the way, if you really want to check them out. But a lot of good things. We must imagine we make. Okay, so here is something. So remember that I said we make, right? We make. Okay, we make. So we made this, an amazing accomplishment. We killed one of the biggest internal seas in 20 years. I want to emphasize that we made that. That didn't fall from the sky. Now, clearly, I'm going into an ironic turn. We also made this. Greenland. We killed what had been there for billions in 20 years. You understand what we're talking about? So, my son, who is an absolutely crazy artist, he hears me talk and he says, you know, if we with very poor key codes, poor DNA, you know, the heart of the instruments, can destroy all of that, is it possible that by making also not particularly impressive instruments, you don't have to be a genius, you don't have to be the people who are doing interstellar, algorithmic whatever discoveries, and very modest, that we could actually put it on a positive vector. So for me, rather than the language of populism, I would rather go this way. We're doing a project together on this. And I want to end with the question of who are we the citizens? With all that I told you, who are we the citizens? And that clearly also connects to this notion of who's the outsider. Is the outsider the immigrant? Or is she more like us? And is the outsider this sort of group that has simply benefited and benefited and benefited no matter what was happening? Who has seen this map? I often show this map. Nobody? The United States also, nobody. It's extraordinary, it's in the public domain. This is 10,000 buildings that are full-time gathering information on all of us, including your grandmother as she was sipping a bit of wine there in the village at some point. Germany has a system like this now, France does, the Netherlands does. I don't know about Turkey, I'm not going to talk about that. But now, this is collecting data on all of us, whoever, you know, I mean, who are we, the citizens? So again, I've unsettled, I hope, and this is my final comment, I have unsettled this notion that there are these right-wing, horrible people. They are horrible, they are right-wing, and I don't like what they're saying. But I think we need to go to a deeper level. What has made them that way? Now, throughout history, we have had people who were like that. I did a book where I look at 200 years of internal European migration. Horrible stuff. Catholic workers in France killed Catholic Italian workers in the salt work of southern because they were the wrong Catholics. Same thing when Baron von Haussmann rebuilds Paris and says he needs some workers. He carefully selected German and Belgian Catholics. Guess what? The French Catholic workers said they're the wrong Catholics. So that was a long time ago. Today, you know, we have different versions of that. So this is something that is always there. This current moment, this period, interests me. I want to intervene, and hence I am focused on this period. And I am very concerned about categories that too easily assume that, oh, so that's what it is. Ah, yeah, that. No. We are dealing with very deep-rooted dynamics, and we're going to have to change something radically, because there is a lot of degrading of people, including ourselves, when we just simply say, oh my God, they are so bad and we are so good. You know, it just weighs on me. It's the migrant in me, it's the person who has lived in so many different countries, you know, that you don't know who you are really. And so I can just see that. So I hope that we have a bit of time for questions. I don't know if we do, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for all the unsettling, and that's what we would like to do really in the conference, and go deeper into these notions and see how we make them really. Now Professor Fuad Kemal is going to say a few words, and then we'll go to questions, and I'm sure there are many. Fuad Kemal is the director of Istanbul Policy Center and professor of international relations at Sabancı University. He has written extensively on globalization, citizenship, democratization, civil society, Turkey-EU relations, and Turkish foreign policy. Among his books are Remaking Turkey, Globalization, Alternative Modernities, Democracy, Turkish Politics in a Changing World, Citizenship in a Global World, European Questions and Turkish Experiences, and Globalization, State, Identity, Difference. And I hope I haven't forgotten one. Here you go.
Yes. Thank you, but poor me, because I had a written text on the challenges to cosmopolitanism, and I had 3 challenges. And one actually was what I call the multi-crises of globalization or global turmoil. And today when we talk about the cosmopolitanism, we are talking about it in a very significant and critical crisis situation. And of course, you know, maybe global turmoil is a better word, because it comes from different areas, and you actually touch upon that. We have a very significant global security crisis, global economic crisis, global leadership crisis, climate change, land grabbing, water, resource nationalism, so on and so forth. And unfortunately, I agree with you that the existing category of, how to think about crisis in a Schumpeterian form, sort of a creative, destructive mode, doesn't work anymore because there's nothing creative about it, and it's a systemic crisis enduring, and unfortunately, as you said, it is actually brutal. And on the one hand, the system becomes more and more complex, in which, for instance, I was, before coming here, I was reading your work on global cities, and in Istanbul Police Center, we have projects on cities, and all these complexities in global cities, intermediary, zones and everything, which is actually very difficult to capture. But on the other hand, I was more interested in your term expulsion, because this actually complexity goes hand in hand with brutality, and I think the system is very brutal and alarming. But of course, as your talk has indicated, it is very difficult to resist to it too, and so that the existing concepts and categories of resistance, alternative transformation doesn't really work either. So one challenge was this, but so I'm kind of saying poor Fuat because you say it. Second is, of course, from Turkish experience to European Union, Hungary and Russia, to Donald Trump case, Brexit and everything. Of course, I might actually be a little different from you in terms of the way that we think about populism. I think it is an important category, and we have to, the second challenge comes from not populism itself, but populist rule and populist governance. And of course, you are from Latin America, and I was doing my PhD, I was reading a lot on Laclau and this whole populism agenda in Turkey, in Latin America. But of course, we were talking about populism as a movement, populism as people. Today, we are not talking about it as a movement, as people. We are talking about this extreme, significant, brutal populist rule of societies, of spaces, of spaces. So we have to make a distinction between populist movement and populist rule. So in this sense, I actually suggest that we have to maintain and we have to think seriously about this moment of new ruling and popping out everywhere. And Turkey is not the only one. It pops out everywhere, and it is no coincidence that, for instance, Islamophobia, populism, and Brexit happened at the same time in Britain, in a very same moment. Of course, this populist rule works on the basis of certain categories that I think inerts. Maybe I agree with you, but first categories, us and them, majoritarianism, kind of myths about history and people that do not really correspond to reality, and also this democratic disconnect and the extreme apathy towards existing political parties, existing system, and everything. But I like your term inert, because one thing that we should actually pose, in terms of populism, as a question is what they really mean by majoritarianism, what they really mean by people, when they actually talk about that. Because from Erdogan to Donald Trump, from Donald Trump to Uban, and everybody talks about people, majoritarianism. And I think you said extremely important thing, and Hande actually mentioned that this people is also sort of a mystical category. And any time they talk about people in a very valuing way, they also devalue people if that people resist in terms of inequality, resist in terms of land grabbing, resist in terms of climate change, and we know people actually, even for the supporters of AK Party, when they actually go on the resistance of places in terms of climate change in the Black Sea, they are demonized right away because they are no longer people, although they vote for the party. If actually people actually sort of try to maintain their right to city and then say something about it, they become not people anymore, they become subversive. So in this sense, majoritarianism in this complex / brutal way works two ways. On the one hand, valuing people as majoritarianism, but on the other hand, immediately devaluing it as they become, sort of a moment of resistance. So in this sense, I agree with you that we have to actually go for this inerts. Yeah. But nevertheless, we have to maintain that I think we have a big challenge to cosmopolitanism in actually. But the third challenge comes from this very term expulsions. And I read it actually a bit different from the way that you describe it, or you write it, and because this expulsion is a bit different from exclusion. And when we talk about globalization, when we talk about modernity, we all talk about these regimes on the basis of regimes of inclusion and exclusion. And so there's no actually kind of a moment of stability, because the moment that we talk about stability, we also talk about those who are excluded from it. But right now, that's why I like the term, the subtitle of the book, Complexity and Brutality. We are actually going a bit beyond these exclusions. And an expulsion that I read actually is, on the one hand, this becomes enduring. That the people have actually long-term unemployments, and so that we forget about them. For instance, in Turkey, we have actually a big problem of rule of law, and then we have actually lots of people in jails. Sort of, they are not arrested; they are detainees, and then but it becomes 6 years. Like Guantanamo case in the United States, it becomes more than exclusion. It becomes maybe a moment of expulsion, because we kind of forget about them, because we cannot talk about them all the time. So 6 years, 7 years, sort of jailed without sort of detaining things. So in this, also, in terms of land grab.
That's interesting, actually, this kind of the Guantanamo situation as signaling one way in which, yeah, there they are. We all know they're there, but in some ways they have crossed that systemic edge and they're out.
Yes, and then it becomes enduring. The more they become enduring, the more maybe they become normalized. They are not normalized. I think expulsion is kind of a moment of beyond exclusion, in a way that people become silent. But at the same time, in our globalization debate in IPC, in my course, of course, water, food, and land are the three. And then I totally agree with you that climate change sometimes does not actually, it captures the reality, but it is beyond it, because we are really talking about a significant, issue here. And then, of course, here there's a big challenge to cosmopolitanism from populist rules, because they become more and more developmentalist, more and more, growth-oriented. The more developmentalist and growth-oriented they are, the more actually they harm these things. And their harm, like your photograph says, is a kind of an enduring harm. So we did it actually, like this neoliberal, and we make it. So I'm not that poor that I thought maybe I was saying poor father. So these are actually my points, but very creative, and it opens up with spaces. And I like the term extractive and inert, and I think we should. But maybe the last point that I like to make is, what can we do about this? And so here, maybe it's not me though, but I always be charged of liberal, postmodern, and everything. But maybe the basic, return to basics is very important. I think we should work on, fundamental rights. The right to existence, right to, liberty, freedom, equality. These are actually extremely important, and I think we should have some, this sort of back to basics type of political agenda. And let me actually,
I agree with that completely, by the way. I really do. Yes.
And courses. I'm not a joke teller, but you know, I like these philosophy books now. The reason I refer to them, Aristotle Goes to Washington, and there is a joke about logic there that John takes his dog out for walking, and in the dark going through the park, and sees his friend Jake under the lamp looking for something. And then he says, you know, what are you looking for? He said, you know, I lost my key and I'm looking for, you know, why you are looking for the key here? And he says, because it's so light here. And so this is
exactly.
So maybe, as you said, you know, maybe we should actually go beyond the light and see how these complex are. But I am very delighted to listen to you, and thank you very much again to be with us. And let's actually open that to the question and answer.